When the world writes someone off, do you follow? Or do you wonder what's lost if you just look away? That question lingered in the stale air of the county shelter, where the smell of antiseptic mingled with wet dog fur, and where, beneath the racket of barking, laughter, and auctioneer patter, Grace Walker felt her heart pound with a strange sense of urgency. 32, eyes marked by long ER shifts and a history she seldom spoke about. She stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, trying to blend in. But the sight of the battered German shepherd in the last cage pulled her forward. The auction was always a noisy spectacle. Local breeders boasting about purebreds, rescue volunteers desperately raising paddles for the hopeless cases, and the odd spectator just here for the drama. The dog in question, labeled only Ranger, sat pressed against the wire mesh, one ear bent, coat dull and patchy, but eyes startlingly alert, a kind of haunted intelligence that Grace couldn't ignore. He was the last to be brought out, and nobody bothered to hide their lack of interest. "Look at that one," someone scoffed from the back, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Probably bites." "Not worth the paperwork," another muttered, setting off a round of nervous chuckles. A teenage girl clutched her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, he's scary." The mother shook her head, eyes moving on. The shelter worker, a tired man with a limp, tugged Ranger's leash gently. The dog resisted at first, then stumbled out, every muscle tense, eyes darting between faces. Someone tossed a joke about damaged goods that made Grace's chest clench. For a second, she thought about leaving. She had come here looking for a distraction from her own sleepless nights. Maybe to volunteer. Maybe to... She wasn't even sure. But the dog's eyes met hers, and in that fleeting second, she saw something she recognized. Fear mixed with a desperate wish for things to be different. The bidding started at $10. Silence. "Come on, folks. He's housebroken at least," the auctioneer called, forcing a brittle smile. A middle-aged man in camo lifted a hand. "I'll take him for 20. Good for guard duty." The shelter worker hesitated, glancing at the dog. Grace caught the flicker of resignation. She could leave, she should leave, but her feet moved before she could talk herself out of it. 30, she called, voice steadier than she felt. Head swiveled. Someone in the back snorted. 35, Camo Man shot back. Grace's jaw tightened. 40, she said. Now the crowd turned interested. "Lady, you know what you're doing?" A woman in a rescue t-shirt called, half teasing, half concerned. Grace ignored her. Camo Man hesitated, eyes flicking to Ranger's scars. "He's probably not worth the shots. Pass." The gavel came down. "Sold for $40 to..." "Grace Walker," she replied. The worker's face softened, just a little. As she moved to the front, the laughter behind her rose, tinged with disbelief. "Good luck," someone jeered. "You're gonna need it." Grace crouched down, letting the leash fall slack. She didn't try to pet him. She just knelt there, letting Ranger sniff the air between them. He trembled, but didn't back away. There was a battered tag on his collar. Simple, cheap, almost an afterthought. One word, Ranger. A gust of wind rattled the thin windows, sending a chill through the room. Grace pulled out her wallet, hands shaking. "I'll pay in cash." The shelter worker nodded. "Thank you. Most folks don't see past the scars." Grace almost replied, but something in her throat caught. She glanced at the crowd. Their amusement was starting to fade, replaced by a faint, uneasy curiosity. She rose, gripping the leash, and led Ranger outside. The sudden quiet hit her first. No barking, no human voices, just the low hum of traffic beyond the parking lot. Ranger paused at the door, flinched at a car horn, and froze when someone dropped a metal clipboard nearby. Grace slowed, giving him space. She whispered, "It's okay, boy. We're just going home." She fumbled the car door open, let him jump in without pressure. Inside, Ranger curled into the far corner of the back seat, muscles knotted. For a moment, Grace sat behind the wheel, keys in her hand, trying to steady her own breath. She glanced in the rearview mirror and caught his gaze. Those eyes, dark and questioning, seemed to ask her something she'd been asking herself for years. What's left when no one believes in you anymore? As she pulled out of the lot, the clouds above rolled heavy and gray. The radio crackled static. Grace switched it off, letting the silence settle between her and her new companion. The world might have laughed at both of them, written them off as broken or unwanted. But as she glanced back at Ranger, she realized that sometimes the stories worth telling, the lives worth saving, are the ones everyone else walks away from. And so began a journey neither of them expected. Two survivors, thrown together by chance, driving toward a future uncertain but, for the first time in a long while, not entirely alone. The drive home was quieter than Grace had expected. Every bump in the road, every shifting shadow outside the car, seemed to send a tremor through Ranger's tense body. She kept glancing into the rearview mirror, watching him huddle as far from her as possible, head down, ears twitching at each new sound. The weight of her decision settled over her shoulders. What if she was in over her head? What if she couldn't reach him? Rain began to splatter across the windshield, and the wipers squeaked in awkward rhythm. Grace gripped the steering wheel, focusing on the familiar streets that wound toward her little bungalow just outside town. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour. Porch lights glowed against the gloom, and a few people peered through windows at the odd sight of a woman leading a battered German shepherd up a rain-slicked driveway. Grace parked under the lone street lamp, the yellow glow painting long shadows. She opened the back door and waited. Ranger remained in the far corner, paws splayed, refusing to move. She didn't push, just sat on the edge of the seat, leaving space, letting the silence stretch. Finally, after what felt like forever, Ranger took a hesitant step out. His nails clicked on the pavement, and he glanced around, sniffing the damp air as if expecting trouble at any moment. Inside, the house felt smaller than usual, suddenly filled with the heavy presence of uncertainty. Grace had prepared a soft bed in the corner of the living room and set out 2 bowls, water and a small pile of shredded rotisserie chicken, hoping the scent might tempt him. But Ranger ignored the food, circling the room's edges, keeping his back to the walls. His every movement was careful, almost rehearsed, as if the wrong step might trigger some invisible trap. Grace watched him, recalling stories she'd heard about shelter dogs, how they sometimes took days, even weeks, to adjust. But this felt different. Every time she shifted her weight or made a small noise, Ranger flinched, muscles tensing as if bracing for a command or correction. Once, when she dropped her keys onto the kitchen counter, he scrambled behind the couch, breathing hard, eyes wild. She tried speaking softly, her voice gentle but steady. "It's okay, Ranger. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." He didn't respond, didn't even glance her way. Instead, he kept his distance, settling in the farthest, darkest corner. Night crept in, bringing a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Grace pulled an old quilt over her lap, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book in hand. She'd read somewhere that dogs found comfort in human voices, even if they didn't understand the words. So she started to read aloud, slowly at first, then with more confidence as she noticed his ears twitch, just barely, at the sound. She chose a story about hope, about finding belonging, and let her words fill the room. Still, Ranger stayed curled up, eyes half shut but never fully relaxed, as if sleep itself was a risk. Later, as midnight ticked past, Grace dozed off in the chair. She woke to a low, muffled whine. Ranger was pacing the room, head down, tail tucked so tight it nearly vanished. He walked in tight circles, breathing quick and shallow. She could see the tremor in his legs, the haunted look in his eyes. Was it a nightmare? Some memory replaying behind those dark eyes? Grace didn't move closer. She just sat and whispered, "It's all right. You're not alone now." Eventually, Ranger collapsed against the wall, legs twitching in sleep. Grace wondered what dreams haunted him, if they were full of sirens and shouting, or if they echoed with loss like her own. She noticed something strange as he shifted in the moonlight, a faded tattoo inside his left ear, almost invisible under the ragged fur. It looked official, blocky, not the mark of a breeder. Grace made a mental note to ask the vet about it in the morning. Sleep was hard to come by for both of them that night. Grace drifted in and out, sometimes woken by Ranger's sharp yelps or the scraping of his claws on the hardwood floor. At dawn, she found him standing at the front door, staring out into the street, as if waiting for someone or something to arrive. Her heart ached with a mix of empathy and doubt. She'd taken him in on instinct, drawn by those wounded eyes, but now she was responsible for a creature with a storm raging inside. She was an ER nurse. She understood trauma, both visible and hidden. But this was different. Ranger couldn't talk about his pain or explain what he'd lost. Grace poured herself a cup of strong coffee and, ignoring her own exhaustion, crouched near his bed. She placed a few pieces of chicken by his paws, keeping her hand open and still. Ranger's nose twitched. He looked at her, then the food, then back to her. Mistrust flickering, but also something softer, almost like curiosity. After several long minutes, he stretched his neck and took a cautious bite, then another. Grace smiled, barely letting herself hope. "That's it, buddy. One small step at a time." The sun crept through the curtains, lighting the living room in soft gold. Outside, the world carried on. Garbage trucks rattled, neighbors started their cars, but inside Grace's house, a fragile peace settled. Ranger curled on the edge of his bed, his body still tense but no longer shaking. As she prepared for the day ahead, Grace caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, eyes ringed with fatigue, hair tousled, but with a new kind of determination. She wouldn't give up, not after seeing what giving up had done to both of them. Before leaving for the vet, she sat again beside Ranger, reading a few more pages from her book. He watched her now, eyes following every movement, as if trying to decode her intentions. Grace reached out slowly, her hand resting palm up on the floor between them. She didn't expect him to come closer, not yet, but she wanted him to know he had a choice. For the first time since bringing him home, Ranger shifted a little nearer, laying his chin on the floor just a few inches from her fingers. Grace exhaled, letting the tension drain away. Maybe they were both haunted by duty, by memories that wouldn't let go. But for tonight, and for as many nights as it took, Grace would be here. Neither of them had to face the darkness alone anymore. Morning in the Walker house started with exhaustion woven into the walls. Grace had barely slept, kept awake by the restless pacing of Ranger and the echo of his quiet whines. She was used to sleep deprivation. Her ER shifts often ran long into the night. But this felt different. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether trust might bloom or if fear would keep its grip. She moved quietly, making coffee, running a hand through her hair. When she brought Ranger's leash from the closet, he froze, his body stiff, hackles rising. The leash seemed to summon some old memory, a command buried deep in his bones. Grace knelt, speaking softly. "Just a walk, okay? Just us." Ranger didn't move until she clipped it on, then followed, moving with the controlled steps of a soldier. Grace noticed every detail now, the way he scanned the front yard, the quick, darting glances to each car and passerby. He wasn't just anxious. He was on alert, like someone trained for danger. The veterinary clinic was busy, phones ringing and animals barking behind closed doors. Grace kept Ranger close, sitting in the corner, eyes averted from the other pet owners. When Dr. Michael Hughes finally called them in, Grace was grateful for the distraction. Dr. Hughes was in his 50s, calm and unhurried, with gentle hands and a way of talking that soothed even the most anxious creatures. "Let's take a look at you, big guy," he murmured, crouching to Ranger's level. Ranger flinched at first, but Dr. Hughes moved slowly, never forcing. Grace mentioned the tattoo in his ear, and Dr. Hughes peered closer, adjusting his glasses. That's not a breeder's mark." He traced the faded numbers with a finger. "That's a K9 police code. See these digits? They're identifiers." Grace blinked, absorbing the words. Dr. Hughes continued, "You might want to talk to someone who's worked with police dogs. I know a guy, Sam Carter, retired handler. He'll have answers." Back in the waiting room, as Dr. Hughes made a call, Grace sat in stunned silence. She'd guessed Ranger had a hard past, but this was something else. A discarded police K9? She pictured him running alongside officers, taking commands, maybe even risking his life. How did a dog like that end up terrified and alone, labeled unwanted at a shelter auction? A few minutes later, a tall, broad-shouldered man in faded jeans and an old sheriff's jacket stepped through the door. He moved with the confidence of someone used to chaos. "Grace Walker?" She nodded, and he offered his hand. "Sam Carter. Mike said you've got a former K9. Mind if I say hi?" In the exam room, Sam crouched a safe distance from Ranger, voice low. "Hey, buddy. I know that look." Ranger regarded him warily, but didn't bolt. Sam's eyes softened as he watched the dog's stiff posture, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. "Can I see his ear?" Grace nodded, and Sam read the faded numbers aloud. This was a city K9 for sure. These dogs are trained for obedience, tracking, even defense. But they see a lot, sometimes too much. He met Grace's eyes. Most people don't realize. When a service dog gets hurt or traumatized, the department moves on. Some are lucky and get rehomed. Others... He let the sentence trail off. Grace felt her chest tighten. "He's so scared. He won't eat unless I sit with him. He won't rest unless it's completely quiet." Sam nodded. "Classic signs of PTSD. Most dogs bounce back, but some can't. And when they can't, they're labeled unfit. The system doesn't have room for broken heroes." Grace looked at Ranger, who was watching her closely now, as if waiting for her reaction. Sam's voice was gentle. "You're giving him something most don't get, a real chance. But it'll take time. He needs routine, calm, someone who won't give up." Grace swallowed hard, thinking of the faces of patients she'd cared for. Soldiers, accident victims, people haunted by things you couldn't see on an X-ray. "He's not the only one who's lost something," she said, almost to herself. Sam smiled, understanding in his eyes. Rescue's a two-way street. The rest of the appointment passed in a blur. Shots updated, a thorough check for injuries, advice about calming routines and safe spaces. Dr. Hughes sent them home with a bag of treats and a quiet, "Good luck." Grace drove home with Ranger in the back seat, the silence between them less tense than before. That afternoon, Grace sat in her small kitchen, scribbling notes on a yellow pad. She listed the routines Sam suggested: feed by hand, avoid loud commands, keep walks short, play calming music. She drew a little heart next to patience. She glanced at Ranger lying on the rug, watching her through half-closed eyes. "You and me, Ranger, we're both learning." She called her sister that night, voice low as she recounted Ranger's story. "He was a K-9, Hannah. Abandoned when he got too damaged to work. Can you believe it?" Her sister sighed on the other end. "People do the same thing to each other, Grace. Don't let it happen to him." As dusk settled, Grace found herself thinking about her late brother, Mark, also a first responder, also haunted by things he'd seen and couldn't forget. The parallels between him and Ranger cut deeper than she liked to admit. She sat by the window, watching Ranger sleep, and promised herself she wouldn't let either of their stories end in abandonment. Before bed, she laid her hand near Ranger's paw. He hesitated, then, with the faintest movement, rested his head against her fingers. The contact was brief, but in that instant something shifted, an unspoken promise between two survivors, both determined to heal, no matter how slow the journey. Grace whispered, "I'm not giving up on you, I promise." The room was quiet except for the dog's steady breathing. Outside, the world was noisy and uncertain, but here in this small, imperfect home, the work of healing had finally begun. Morning brought a silver light to the house, filtering softly through thin curtains, drawing gentle patterns across the floor where Ranger slept. Grace lay awake in her room for a long time, listening to the soft pad of his footsteps as he explored the quiet spaces, taking in the unfamiliar scents and sounds of this new place. There was comfort in that subtle noise, a reassurance that her decision to bring him home, however impulsive, was not a mistake, even if every step since had felt like walking through a fog of uncertainty. Grace rose quietly, careful not to startle him, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. She poured herself coffee, eyes on the list she'd made with Sam Carter's help the day before. The instructions were clear, but she knew that routines, no matter how well crafted, could only take you so far. Healing was messier, slower, filled with moments of doubt and moments of small, almost invisible victories. Ranger's eyes tracked her every movement, but the wariness in his body had softened, just a fraction, since the previous day. Grace sat on the floor a few feet from him, placed a bowl with a few pieces of chicken and rice, and waited. He studied her, glanced at the food, then, with painstaking slowness, edged forward to eat. Each bite was hesitant, as if expecting the sudden bark of a command or a sharp tug of a leash. But no order came, only the steady warmth of her presence and her gentle voice, reading aloud from her dog-eared paperback, stories of hope and survival. After breakfast, she clipped on Ranger's leash with a calm, practiced motion and led him into the backyard. The sky was cloudless, the air carrying the faint scent of cut grass. They walked in slow circles, Ranger never venturing far from her side, ears flicking at every car engine or distant siren. He startled at the sound of a garbage truck, freezing in place until Grace knelt beside him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're okay, buddy," she whispered, letting him feel her steady breathing. Eventually, he took a tentative step forward, then another. Inside, Grace set about creating a routine. She started with short, predictable walks, just to the mailbox and back, then slowly extended the route, always letting Ranger set the pace. She hand-fed him meals, using a soft voice and gentle words. She played calming music in the evenings, letting the soothing notes fill the house. She avoided loud noises, sharp movements, and especially any hint of authority in her posture or tone. Each evening, she recorded the day's progress in a small journal, a habit she'd developed after her brother's death, a way to make sense of things she couldn't always say out loud. The progress was slow. Ranger startled at every siren, every police cruiser passing down the block, his body shrinking as if trying to disappear. When neighbors walked by in uniforms, postal workers, delivery drivers, he would pace and whine, unable to settle until the threat had passed. Grace learned to anticipate his triggers, guiding him gently away or offering a quiet place to retreat. There were setbacks, moments when she wondered if he would ever trust her, or if his scars were simply too deep. But then came the little victories, a wag of the tail when she walked into the room, a tentative nudge of his nose against her hand, a moment where he lay at her feet during a thunderstorm instead of hiding beneath the bed. Each time, Grace celebrated quietly, letting him decide how close to come, how much to trust. At night, when the world was still, Grace would sit at the kitchen table with her journal, writing about Ranger's progress, but also about her own. She wrote about Mark, her late brother, how he'd been a firefighter, how he'd always seemed invincible until the day the weight of his experiences became too much. She wrote about her guilt, her grief, and the strange, unexpected comfort she found in Ranger's company. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the walls with gold, Grace found herself telling Ranger the story of her brother. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, Ranger curled nearby, his eyes half closed but his ears turned toward her. "Mark was brave," she murmured, "but even the brave can break. I guess we both know that, huh?" Ranger looked at her, head tilted, and she felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out, palm up, and to her surprise, he pressed his head against her hand, warm and steady. For a long moment they sat together, sharing a silence filled not with fear, but with understanding. As days passed, their routine became a lifeline, steady, reliable, and healing for them both. Grace realized she was beginning to sleep better, her nightmares less frequent, her anxiety less sharp. She found herself looking forward to the small rituals, feeding Ranger, walking at dusk, reading aloud while he lay at her feet. The routines that soothed him also soothed her, knitting together the ragged edges of her own grief. One afternoon, Sam Carter stopped by to check on their progress. He watched as Grace guided Ranger through a gentle walk around the yard, her voice low and reassuring. "You're doing good work, Grace," he said, hands in his pockets. "Not everyone would stick it out. It takes patience." Grace smiled, her gaze on Ranger. "He's worth it. I just hope it's enough." Sam nodded. "Healing's not about erasing the scars. It's about learning to live with them and letting them remind you how far you've come." That night, as the house settled into quiet, Grace wrote in her journal, her words flowing easier than they had in years. "Today, Ranger laid his head in my lap for the first time. It felt like trust. Maybe in helping him heal, I'm learning to heal myself." As she drifted off to sleep, Ranger curled at the foot of her bed, breathing softly. For the first time in a long while, Grace believed that hope, like healing, might be possible, one patient step at a time. It was nearly midnight when the thunderstorm rolled in, announced by a jagged flash of lightning that lit up the street outside Grace's window. The first low rumble was enough to rattle the glass panes, But what followed inside the house was far more unsettling. Ranger, curled at the foot of Grace's bed, bolted upright at the first crash. His body snapped into rigid alertness, eyes wide, ears pinned flat. Another flash, brighter this time, sent him scrambling off the bed and into the hallway, claws skittering across the hardwood. Grace sat up instantly, heart pounding. She'd been warned about triggers. Sam Carter had mentioned that loud, unpredictable noises could set Ranger off, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer terror in his eyes. She moved to the doorway just as a tremendous boom shook the whole house. Ranger yelped, then darted for the living room, desperately searching for somewhere to hide. "Ranger! Hey, it's okay, buddy!" Grace called after him, trying to keep her voice calm, but the panic in the dog's movements made her own anxiety spike. She found him wedged behind the couch, trembling so violently his collar jingled with every breath. His chest heaved, and his eyes darted everywhere, looking for escape. The storm intensified, rain battering the roof and wind whipping tree branches against the siding. Every fresh crack of thunder sent Ranger deeper into panic. Grace knelt on the floor, careful not to block his exit, and spoke softly over the noise. "You're safe, I promise. You're safe with me." But he could hardly hear her over the storm and the frantic beating of his own heart. Minutes passed in a kind of standoff. Grace sitting patiently, Ranger refusing to budge, the storm raging outside. Then a particularly loud crack sent Ranger scrambling out from behind the couch. Tail tucked, head low, he crashed into the kitchen, claws scrabbling on tile, finally cramming himself under the small breakfast table, knocking over a chair in the process. At that moment, a sharp rap at the door jolted them both. Grace's neighbor, Mrs. Abrams, stood on the porch, concern etched on her face even through the rain. "Grace, are you all right? Is that your dog howling?" Grace glanced back at Ranger, who was now whining, a long, broken sound that rose and fell with each thunderclap. "He's just scared of the storm, Mrs. Abrams. I'm sorry if he's keeping you up." The neighbor frowned. "It's not just me, dear. The whole block can hear him. Maybe you could—" Grace held up a hand. "I'll take care of it. Thank you for checking." She closed the door gently, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration. Her landlord's car had pulled up across the street, headlights illuminating her windows for a moment before flicking off. Grace's stomach clenched. She knew noise complaints weren't taken lightly here. She returned to the kitchen, crouching beside the table. Ranger was pressed so far back she could barely reach him. "Hey, big guy. I know you're scared." She eased herself onto the floor, back against the cabinets, and started to hum softly, a tune her brother used to sing on stormy nights. The sound seemed to cut through Ranger's panic just a little. His breathing slowed, and the wildness in his eyes faded to something softer, though he still wouldn't come out. By 2 a.m, the rain had slackened, thunder now a distant echo, but the damage lingered. Grace stayed on the kitchen floor, whispering softly, voice hoarse. "You're safe now, Ranger. I'm not going anywhere." She wanted desperately to reach out, to pull him into a hug, but knew that forcing comfort would only deepen his fear. Just before dawn, Ranger finally inched forward, his body stiff and low. He rested his head in Grace's lap, exhausted, eyes closing for the first time all night. She stroked his fur gently, tears stinging her eyes, not from frustration, but from a fierce protectiveness. "I'm here," she promised again and again, letting him feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat through her hands. That morning, Grace called Sam for advice. He arrived with a large crate and several thick blankets. "Dogs like Ranger need a safe den, a place where they can hide, but still feel secure," he explained, helping her set up a quiet corner in the living room. He showed Grace how to line the crate with her old shirts and familiar scents, transforming it into a cozy retreat. It took hours of coaxing, but by that evening, Ranger ventured into the crate on his own. Grace praised him softly, slipping him treats and letting him know this was his space, his fortress. She hung a towel over the front, muffling sounds, creating a cave of calm. But even with these changes, the setback weighed on her. That night, the landlord stopped by, frowning as he recounted the complaints. "I know he's been through a lot," he said, "but if this keeps up, we'll have to talk about other options." Grace nodded, guilt churning in her chest, but her resolve hardened. She would not let Ranger lose another home. Over the next few days, she stayed vigilant, learning to read the warning signs: a stiffened tail, flattened ears, the restless pacing before a panic. She kept her phone close, in case another storm rolled in, and reassured her neighbors that she was working with a trainer. Each night, she sat by Ranger's crate, reading quietly, whispering stories of hope and healing. Some nights he stayed inside, curled tight in his new den. Other nights he crept out, settling by her feet, head heavy in her lap. The journey had grown harder, but Grace's commitment was only stronger now. She scribbled in her journal, "We faced the shadows tonight, and they nearly swallowed us both. But we're still here. I won't give up, not on him and not on myself." In the dim morning light, Ranger wagged his tail, just once, just for her, and Grace knew they were winning, one storm at a time. After the storm, a sense of fragile peace settled over Grace's home. With Sam Carter's help, Ranger began to make real progress, seeking out his crate when uneasy, returning to her side after a fright, even taking comfort from the hum of her voice as she read by lamplight. Grace found herself growing deeply attached to this wounded soul who, despite everything, wanted so badly to trust. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe they were finally building something steady and good. One bright morning, the sun broke through weeks of gray, scattering warm light across the kitchen table. Grace sat filling out paperwork, her hands shaking as she signed the final adoption forms from the shelter. Dr. Hughes had agreed to witness the paperwork, Sam beside her, both men offering quiet encouragement. The moment the pen lifted from the last page, Grace smiled, feeling a swell of hope. "You're mine now, officially," she told Ranger, who wagged his tail and pressed his nose into her palm. It was a small celebration, just coffee, cinnamon rolls, and laughter. But it felt like a milestone, a mark of a future reclaimed. But peace, Grace was learning, was always temporary. That afternoon, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She nearly let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made her answer. "Grace Walker?" "Yes. Who's calling?" The voice on the other end was clipped, official. "My name is Victor Harland. I understand you adopted a dog recently. German Shepherd responds to Ranger." Grace felt a jolt of apprehension. "Yes, I did. Is there a problem?" "I was Ranger's original handler. I'd like to discuss his return." Grace's chest tightened. She remembered what Sam and Dr. Hughes had said about K9S, how they sometimes bounced from handler to handler, how trauma was often ignored or misunderstood. "I'm sorry, but Ranger's been legally adopted. He's part of my family now." Victor's tone grew sharper. That dog was never meant for civilian life. He's trained, he's valuable, and frankly, you don't know what you're dealing with. Before Grace could respond, he hung up. Heart pounding, Grace relayed the conversation to Sam. He scowled, jaw clenched. "Victor Harland? I know him by reputation. He was tough on his dogs, expected them to perform no matter the cost. If Ranger was with him, I'm not surprised by the trauma. Can he take Ranger back? Grace asked, voice small. Not if the adoption's legal and you can prove you've provided care. But he might try. Sure enough, a few days later, a thick envelope arrived. Legal paperwork demanding Ranger's return. The language was cold and impersonal, referring to Ranger by his service number, as if he were equipment rather than a living soul. Victor's attorney argued that the dog's recovery was proof he was fit for duty again, and thus should be returned to his original handler. The days that followed were a blur of worry and preparation. Grace called the shelter, who confirmed that the adoption was valid. Sam and Dr. Hughes both offered to testify on her behalf. Still, the anxiety gnawed at her. At night, she woke from dreams where Ranger was ripped from her arms, dragged back to a world where love was conditional and safety was a memory. The custody hearing was set for a Thursday morning. Grace dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue blouse and neat slacks, wanting to appear strong but approachable. She arrived at the courthouse with Ranger beside her, leash looped around her wrist, his head held low but steady. Sam and Dr. Hughes were there too, both offering quiet support. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet conversation. Victor Harlan sat on the opposite bench, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate. His eyes were hard as stone, his mouth set in a thin line. Ranger shrank at the sight of him, body trembling, tail tucked tightly. The judge called the room to order, and the proceedings began. Victor's lawyer painted a picture of duty and loyalty, arguing that Ranger belonged with his handler, that he was needed for police work, that he'd been stolen by a well-meaning civilian. Grace's heart hammered as she listened, fists clenched in her lap. When her turn came, Grace spoke quietly but firmly. She told the judge about Ranger's condition when she found him, malnourished, traumatized, terrified of the world. She described their routine, the progress he'd made, the bond they'd built. Sam and Dr. Hughes took the stand, describing Ranger's PTSD, the gentle care Grace had provided, the legal adoption process. Then came the moment everyone seemed to be waiting for. Victor approached, commanding voice booming, "Come!" Ranger froze, every muscle locked. The room held its breath. Victor called again, sharper this time. Still, Ranger didn't move. Then, trembling, he looked from Victor to Grace, eyes wide, searching for safety. With a whimper, he turned away from Victor, padding across the floor to Grace, pressing his head into her lap. The judge watched this exchange with quiet intensity. After a long moment, she spoke. The law recognizes not just paperwork, but the well-being of the animal. Ranger has found safety and healing with Miss Walker. I rule in her favor. Victor stood, face red, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stormed from the room, leaving only the echo of his boots behind. Grace hugged Ranger tightly, relief washing through her. Sam and Dr. Hughes offered congratulations, but the only celebration Grace needed was the weight of Ranger's head in her lap, the soft thump of his tail against her leg. On the way home, sun streaming through the windshield, Grace reached over to scratch Ranger behind the ears. "You're home, buddy, for good this time." Ranger sighed, his body finally relaxing, as if he understood that, after so much loss, he was finally, truly safe. And so was Grace. It felt as if the entire house breathed a sigh of relief after the custody hearing. For days afterward, Grace moved with a lighter step, her worries replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. She noticed it in the small moments, the way she hummed while making coffee, how she found herself smiling at the sunrise, and especially in the new calmness that seemed to radiate from Ranger. Even neighbors commented on the change. Mrs. Abrams waved from her porch, calling, "He looks happier," as Ranger trotted beside Grace on their morning walk, his gait loose and tail waving, ears perked at every sound. With Victor Harland gone from their lives, it was as if a shadow had finally lifted. Sam Carter suggested the time was right to push a little further, to see what Ranger could become with the weight of the past truly behind him. "He needs more than safety," Sam said, watching Ranger watch a flock of pigeons scatter from the park path. "He needs to remember what it means to play, to trust his instincts, to enjoy being a dog again." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with hope. That weekend, she signed them up for an agility and play therapy program run by a local trainer with experience working with rescue and retired K9s. The first day, the park was alive with barking dogs, laughter, and a scattering of bright orange cones and tunnels arranged in a sprawling course. Grace arrived early, hands sweating as she clipped on Ranger's leash and led him through the gate. For a moment he hesitated, sensing the nervous energy all around, then followed her with a determined, almost cautious curiosity. The trainer, a kind woman named Trina, greeted them with a warm smile and a bag of treats. "Every dog goes at their own pace here," she explained, offering Ranger a treat from her open palm. Ranger sniffed, then gently accepted it, looking back at Grace for reassurance. The class began with simple exercises, walking over a low bar, weaving through cones, jumping onto a padded platform. Ranger watched the other dogs carefully, ears flicking with every command and cheer. Grace knelt beside him, whispering encouragement. "You can do this, buddy. Just try." At first, Ranger balked at the obstacles, circling back to Grace after each attempt, as if checking for permission. Trina offered patient tips, suggesting Grace use a cheerful, playful voice and reward every small success with praise and gentle touch. Slowly, the tension began to melt away. Ranger took his first leap over the low bar, landing a bit awkwardly but standing tall, tail wagging in surprise at his own achievement. By the end of the session, something extraordinary had shifted. Ranger trotted across the grass to Grace, tongue lolling, eyes bright with the excitement of the moment. A group of children, there to watch their own dogs, lined up along the fence, clapping and laughing as Ranger zipped through the tunnel for the first time. "Look at him go," one boy called. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming pride in watching Ranger reclaim a piece of himself. As the weeks passed, Ranger blossomed. He grew more confident with each agility session, sometimes even leading Grace onto the course, tugging her toward his favorite obstacles. He learned to catch tennis balls, race other dogs, and even nudge smaller, shy rescues toward the treats table, as if reminding them it was okay to trust. The scars on his muzzle faded beneath healthy fur, but the biggest transformation was in his eyes. Where once there had been only fear, now there was curiosity, mischief, and joy. The changes in Ranger inspired changes in Grace, too. She found herself lingering at the park after class, chatting with other dog owners, swapping stories of rescue and redemption. She signed up to volunteer at the center, helping new adopters settle their anxious dogs into group play. The support from her small community gave her strength she hadn't realized she was missing. Sam Carter noticed the difference. "You're both healing," he said one afternoon, watching as Grace guided Ranger through a complex agility run, her laughter ringing out clear and free. "You gave him his life back, Grace, and he's giving you yours." Ranger's story began to spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. A local journalist who volunteered at the park wrote an article about the former K9 and the ER nurse who had rescued him, calling them heroes who rescued each other. The story resonated. Families who had once passed by Grace's house in silence now stopped to say hello, sometimes bringing their children to meet the famous ranger. Grace never tired of telling his story, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to second chances. Ranger seemed to sense when someone needed comfort. At the park, he'd approach children who were shy or nervous, sitting patiently until they reached out a trembling hand to stroke his fur. Sometimes, at Grace's side in the evenings, he would rest his head in her lap as she read from her journal or prepared her notes for work. The quiet companionship soothed her, and on more than one occasion, she caught herself talking to him about her brother, her grief, and her hopes for the future. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench as the sun dipped behind the trees, Grace looked down to find Ranger curled beside her, breathing slow and even, at peace in a way she'd never dared dream for him. The sense of loss she'd carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a gentle gratitude for the journey they'd shared. They had found freedom, together, freedom from fear, from the weight of the past, and from the belief that scars defined them. In that golden moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty, healing wasn't just possible, it was already happening, right here, in the laughter of children, in the gleam of Ranger's eyes, and in every joyful step they took together, finally, truly running free. The world always notices a spark, especially when it comes from those who were once left in the dark. In the weeks that followed Ranger's transformation, the story of the broken K9 who found hope and the nurse who wouldn't give up rippled through the town, finding its way into schools, coffee shops, and community meetings. Grace would walk Ranger down the sidewalk, and strangers would stop, smiling, asking for updates. Sometimes children ran up just to pet him, giggling as Ranger, tail wagging, gently nudged their hands. But it wasn't only children who saw themselves in Ranger. Grace noticed adults pausing, lost in thought, running a hand over his head, and then quietly sharing their own struggles. Divorces, lost jobs, old wounds. Each encounter reminded Grace just how deeply a story of healing could resonate. Ranger, for his part, wore his role as a community mascot with dignity and patience. At the park, he'd let toddlers crawl over his paws or stand guard near elderly neighbors, as if keeping silent vigil over those still searching for comfort. Sam Carter saw an opportunity in this momentum. One crisp Saturday morning, as Grace and Ranger finished an agility class, Sam leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a smile playing at his lips. "You know, we could do more than just tell Ranger's story. We could help a whole lot more dogs, and people too, if we put our heads together." Grace looked at him, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "I mean a program. Second Leash. We take retired K9S and shelter rescues, ones like Ranger who've been given up on, and train them, heal them, and find them new homes with folks who understand trauma. You could be the face, Grace. You and Ranger together." The idea filled her with a rush of hope and nerves. She remembered how lost she'd felt those first nights, how she'd worried she wasn't enough, that Ranger's pain was too great. But now, standing here with Ranger by her side, she realized how far they'd come. If their journey could inspire others to open their hearts, maybe it was time to try. They got to work. Grace and Sam teamed up with Dr. Hughes, who agreed to volunteer as the program's veterinary advisor. They reached out to the shelter, put up flyers at the park, and spoke at community meetings. Soon, Second Leash became more than an idea. It became a movement. The program's first class included 3 retired K9S, 2 anxious mixed breeds from the shelter, and a young family willing to foster. Grace led the orientation, voice trembling with nerves at first, then steadying as she told Ranger's story. These dogs aren't broken. They're just waiting for someone to see their worth, someone who understands that healing takes time and patience, but it's always possible. Ranger stood quietly at her side, occasionally nudging the other dogs or greeting the families with a gentle sniff. He became the program's living symbol, not just a survivor, but a beacon. Children from local schools came to visit, learning about service dogs, trust, and the value of second chances. Grace watched as their eyes lit up, listened to their questions, and felt a quiet pride bloom inside her chest. The success stories began to multiply. One by one, the unwanted dogs learned to trust again, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. There was Bandit, the graying Labrador who'd failed police training but became a therapy companion for a lonely veteran. There was Luna, a skittish border collie who found her forever home with a widowed teacher, who credited Luna's devotion for pulling her out of depression. Every adoption came with its own struggles and setbacks, but Grace made sure each new family had the tools, the patience, and the support to persevere. Sometimes the program hit roadblocks: dogs who relapsed into fear, families who called in tears, unsure if they could keep going. Grace visited those homes, Ranger in tow, and shared her own doubts and the setbacks she and Ranger had overcome. She reminded them, it's never about being perfect. It's about showing up again and again, even when it's hard. Her words and Ranger's calm presence gave them hope. Grace and Sam expanded their efforts, visiting schools to teach children about empathy, the invisible wounds animals can carry, and the importance of giving others a second chance. Ranger loved these visits, especially when the shyest kids finally reached out to pet him, faces breaking into shy smiles. One afternoon, the local news filmed a segment about Second Leash. The reporter asked Grace, "Why do you do it?" Grace glanced down at Ranger, who sat pressed against her leg, and answered simply, "Because I know what it's like to feel lost, and I know how much it means when someone doesn't give up on you." The ripple effect was powerful. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, families who'd once dismissed damaged dogs now lined up to learn more about the program. Grace realized that what had started as a desperate rescue had become a legacy, a force changing hearts and lives across her community. Through it all, Ranger was there, at her side in every training class, gently coaxing frightened dogs out of corners, playing with children on the playground, even visiting the hospital where Grace worked to offer comfort on tough shifts. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now shone with quiet confidence and a wisdom that drew people in. One evening, after a long day of classes, Grace sat with Sam on the shelter steps, watching Ranger lead a group of children in a slow walk around the yard. The golden light of dusk stretched their shadows long across the grass. "You know," Sam said, "I think you've started something here. Something big." Grace smiled, feeling the truth of it settle deep in her bones. "I just wanted to help one dog. But maybe we're all a little broken, and maybe we all need a second leash sometimes." In that soft, hopeful dusk, with Ranger trotting back toward her, tongue lolling and eyes bright, Grace felt at peace. Their scars would never disappear, but they no longer defined them. Instead, those scars had become beacons, lighting the way for everyone searching for a second chance. Even as life settled into its new, hopeful rhythm, Grace never lost sight of the journey that brought her here. Each day at the Second Leash program, she watched more unwanted dogs and hesitant adopters take the first trembling steps toward trust. And every day, Ranger moved among them. not just as a symbol of survival, but as a living testament to the slow, often invisible work of healing. One Thursday evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Grace sat in a folding chair at her weekly therapy group. It was her turn to share. For a moment she hesitated, scanning the circle of faces, some familiar, others new, all carrying stories she knew ran deeper than their introductions. Ranger lay at her feet, head resting on her shoe, his presence as steady as a heartbeat. She began, her voice quiet but unwavering. I thought I was saving a dog when I adopted Ranger. I thought the hard part would be feeding him, walking him, teaching him not to be afraid. But I was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to sit with pain, his and mine, without looking away. She glanced down as Ranger let out a soft sigh, as if encouraging her to continue. Service can break those who give too much. My brother Mark was a firefighter. He always ran toward danger, never away. But I saw how that wore him down, piece by piece, until one day he couldn't run anymore. Losing him made me think no one ever truly heals. Ranger, he proved me wrong. Healing happens. It's slow, it's never perfect, but it's possible. Heads nodded around the circle. One woman dabbed her eyes, another squeezed Grace's hand in silent solidarity. Grace continued, Ranger's scars aren't just on the outside. He has bad nights. Sometimes a siren or a loud bang will still send him hiding, but he comes back. Every time he comes back. He taught me that the only way through pain is together, with patience and a safe place to land. Not everyone gets that. Not every dog, not every person. But when they do, you see something incredible. Trust rebuilt, hope restored. Her mind wandered to the early days, how hopeless she'd felt when Ranger cowered in corners, when his panic felt contagious. She remembered reading aloud to him in the darkness, her own hands shaking as much as his body did. Now she was the one helping others, just as Sam and Dr. Hughes had helped her. Now she could say with certainty that scars could become something other than reminders of pain. They could become bridges, connections, reasons to fight for second chances. That night, after group, Grace sat at home and opened her journal, a ritual that had become as comforting as a heartbeat. She wrote, Ranger and Mark, different wounds, but both carried the cost of caring too much. They remind me that the world often fails the vulnerable, that systems let people and dogs slip through the cracks. But compassion, real, stubborn, everyday compassion, can change the story. You don't have to be a hero to help. You just have to stay, to listen, to try. She paused, pen hovering, and thought about the families in second leash. How nervous they looked at first. How they began to smile and open up as their dogs did. She remembered one little girl who'd whispered, I used to be scared all the time too. But my dog's not scared anymore, so maybe I don't have to be either. In that moment, Grace saw the truth. Second chances heal both sides. The next day at the shelter, she and Sam led a workshop for new adopters. Grace shared the realities, setbacks, fears, the slow progress that could feel like failure one day and a miracle the next. She encouraged them to write down every victory, no matter how small, a wagging tail, a moment of eye contact, a dog resting its head in a lap for the very first time. She told them, these are the moments that matter. Not the perfect days, but the days when you keep showing up. After class, a new volunteer approached, uncertain. What if I'm not enough for my dog? What if she never gets better? Grace smiled gently, remembering her own fear. You don't have to be perfect. Just patient. Just present. Sometimes that's all any of us need. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Grace took Ranger for a walk through the park. They passed a group of kids tossing a frisbee, And Ranger, once terrified of sudden movement, bounded over, tail wagging, asking to join. The children squealed with delight as he leaped and chased, pure joy lighting up his face. Grace laughed, feeling the last of her old sorrow fade in the golden light. That night, she wrote again in her journal, "Helping Ranger helped me find the courage to face my own loss and believe in healing again. I'm still learning. We both are. But maybe that's what it means to survive. Not to forget what hurt you, but to let it change you into someone who can help others heal." She finished the entry, heart lighter than it had been in years. Ranger curled up at her feet, offering silent comfort. Grace knew that their scars would never vanish, but they no longer had to hide them. Instead, they could use them to teach, to connect, to inspire. Before bed, she reflected on the lesson Ranger had taught her, a lesson she now shared with every person who entered her life. Scars don't make you weak. They show you survived. They mean you're strong enough to help someone else find their way through. And as the night deepened, Grace listened to Ranger's steady breathing, knowing with certainty that neither of them would ever have to face their shadows alone again. Years slipped by quietly, marked by seasons and the subtle passage of healing. For Grace, each new morning feels like a soft victory. The house that once echoed with doubt is now a sanctuary filled with gentle laughter, paw prints in the hallway, and the steady rhythm of lives rebuilt, one day at a time. Ranger, now with a silvery muzzle, still patrols the yard at sunrise, his stride easy, eyes warm and wise. The scars he carried from the past are faded now, visible only if you know where to look. The living room has transformed too. The wall above Grace's desk is crowded with framed photos, former K9S napping on couches, rescue mutts sprawled across children's laps, therapy dogs beside elderly men in wheelchairs, every face a testament to second chances. At the center is a picture of Ranger, eyes bright, surrounded by children on the grass, his tag gleaming, retired, loved, worthy. Grace's days are busy, but she always finds time to help new adopters at the Second Leash program. She welcomes nervous families, listens to their stories, and reassures them that setbacks are part of the journey. Her words carry the weight of experience and the softness of hard-earned hope. She sees herself in their questions, their hesitant joy, and sometimes in the weariness in their eyes. Each visit is a reminder that real change is built not in dramatic leaps, but in quiet persistence, feeding, listening, showing up day after day. One blustery fall afternoon, the shelter hosts its annual reunion for adopted dogs and their families. The park is alive with laughter, children racing through fallen leaves, dogs darting after tennis balls. Grace stands beneath a maple tree, Ranger by her side, greeting old friends and new faces alike. Sam Carter is there, grinning as he wrangles a pack of boisterous retrievers. Dr. Hughes, hair more silver than gray now, hands out dog biscuits to a line of eager noses. The sense of community is palpable, built not only on shared joy, but on the knowledge of what it means to keep going, even when it's hard. As the sun dips low, the crowd gathers around Grace and Ranger for a group photo. She kneels, arm around her old friend, and the camera catches a moment of pure peace. The scars, the struggles, and the victories all written quietly into the way they lean into each other. Later, as people begin to leave, a young woman lingers behind. She tells Grace that her own dog, adopted from Second Leash, now visits the local children's hospital as a therapy companion. "You started all this," the woman says, voice full of gratitude. "You changed our lives." Grace shakes her head, smiling. "We all did. That's how it works. One act of compassion leads to another, and sometimes the hero you save ends up saving you right back. That night, back at home, Grace joins her support group online, sharing the day's joys and the memories that linger. She holds up a photo of Ranger and the kids at the park, telling the group, "We can't change the past, but we can refuse to let the broken stay broken. That's the choice we have every day, to look away or to reach out and help someone stand again." A chorus of support rises from the group, stories tumbling out of foster parents, rescue volunteers, teachers, neighbors, all linked by the belief that every life matters. Grace listens, heart full, and thinks of her brother Mark, of Ranger's first trembling steps into her home, of the fear and the hope that defined their journey. She knows the road isn't always easy. Setbacks still come, and old wounds sometimes ache on stormy nights. But she's learned to meet them with patience, humor, and the knowledge that she's not alone. Before bed, Grace sits in her quiet living room, Ranger at her feet. She gazes at the wall of photos, eyes lingering on the faces of the dogs who've found peace, the families who have grown stronger. She thinks of the children Ranger has comforted, the lonely hearts he's brought back to life, and the countless ripples their story has sent out into the world. She scribbles one last journal entry, the words flowing steady and sure. Healing is possible for all who are willing to try, together. Every act of kindness matters. A single second chance can change everything. True heroes aren't those who never break, but those who dare to heal and help others do the same. Ranger's story proves it. So does mine. As she closes her journal, Grace reaches down to stroke Ranger's graying fur. He sighs, tail thumping, and looks up at her with eyes still full of trust. She whispers, "Thank you, old friend, for saving me too." The moonlight spills across the floor as the house settles into peace. In the yard outside, the echoes of the reunion linger. Children's laughter, dogs barking, the steady drum of hope continuing on. Ranger dreams at Grace's feet, paws twitching, no longer haunted but finally, beautifully free. Their story will be told again and again, to nervous adopters, hopeful children, and anyone who wonders if it's too late for a new beginning. Grace will always say the same thing, her voice sure. Sometimes, the hero the world leaves behind is the one who saves you right back. And so, with every new dawn, in every life touched, the legacy of the unwanted lives on, brighter, stronger, proof that love and healing are never wasted, and that the world changes for the better, one second chance at a time.